It was a rainy Tuesday when Sarah first learned about the police corruption that had been quietly spreading in the city. She had always admired law enforcement, believing they were the protectors of justice. But as a young investigative journalist, Sarah had uncovered a troubling pattern. Stories from local residents, whispers in the streets, and reports from sources she trusted painted a different picture of the men and women in uniform. It wasn't just small mistakes or isolated incidents. No, this went deeper. There were officers accepting bribes, covering up crimes, and even targeting the very people they were supposed to protect. It wasn't something that could simply be ignored. Sarah knew she had to act, but the question was how. As she sat at her desk, looking out at the darkened city, the weight of the decision settled on her. Exposing corruption in the police force was no easy task. If she went public with what she had learned, she risked not only her career, but also her safety. She thought about the lives of the people she loved, her family and friends. What if they became targets? What if the story turned on her? Still, something inside Sarah refused to back down. She had always believed in the power of truth. If she had learned one thing as a journalist, it was that sometimes, in order to make a difference, you had to be willing to face danger. She couldn't just sit by and hope someone else would do it. No, it was up to her. But how could she even begin? She couldn't just walk into the police department and announce she was there to expose corruption. She needed a plan. A good one. Sarah spent the next few days researching, gathering as much information as she could. She made calls to her contacts, asking questions, trying to piece together the full picture. It became clear that this wasn't going to be a quick job. There were layers of secrecy and lies, and the people at the center of it were powerful. Eventually, after hours of research, Sarah found the answer. She would have to go undercover. It was risky, but it was the only way to truly understand what was going on and gather the evidence she needed. She had the skills. She was smart, resourceful, and relentless. But most importantly, she had the courage to take on a system much larger than herself. The next step was to prepare. Sarah knew that getting close to the officers would be difficult, but she was ready. She couldn't let fear hold her back. She had made up her mind. She would do whatever it took to expose the truth. As she looked at the city once again, she felt a sense of determination wash over her. This was just the beginning. Her journey would be long, filled with challenges, but she was ready to face them head-on. No matter what it took, Sarah was about to change everything. Sarah's decision to go undercover was only the beginning. Now came the hard part, preparing for the role she would play. She couldn't simply walk into the police station and announce she was there to uncover the truth. She had to blend in, gain their trust, and gather the evidence without ever raising suspicion. The stakes were high, and the risks were even higher. If anyone found out who she really was, the entire operation would fail. The first thing she needed was a convincing backstory. She couldn't be just anyone. She had to be someone who made sense in the department. After hours of brainstorming, Sarah decided to pretend to be a young woman who had recently moved to the city and was looking for a fresh start. She would say she had a history of struggling with personal issues, but was now determined to turn her life around. It was simple, believable, and most importantly, it wouldn't draw attention. Sarah spent the next few days putting together her cover story. She even practiced her new life in front of a mirror. It felt strange, but she knew it was necessary. She had to be convincing, or everything would fall apart before it even began. Once the backstory was in place, Sarah turned her attention to the more practical details. She needed to gain access to the police department, and for that, she would have to start at the very bottom. She looked into civilian roles within the department, something that wouldn't seem out of place for someone like her. After researching several options, she applied for a clerical position, a job that would give her easy access to the officers while also providing cover for her investigation. The interview process was nerve-wracking. Sarah had to answer every question with confidence, even though she was terrified inside. But she didn't let it show. She smiled, spoke clearly, and made sure to emphasize her desire to contribute to the community and her willingness to work hard. After what felt like an eternity, the interviewer finally gave her a nod. "You're hired," he said with a smile. Sarah felt a rush of relief. She had made it through the first obstacle, but she knew this was just the beginning. Her real work was about to start. In the following days, Sarah familiarized herself with the police department structure, learning the names of the officers and the layout of the building. She paid close attention to the routines, the hierarchy, and the way things operated. She made sure to blend in, keeping her head down and staying quiet. It was important not to draw attention to herself while she figured out her next steps. Her first few weeks on the job were uneventful. She mostly worked behind a desk, filing paperwork and answering phones. But the more she observed, the more she began to see cracks in the system. There were small things at first. Officers laughing together after receiving envelopes filled with cash, or whispering about certain favors they had done for a few local businesses. Sarah's heart pounded every time she witnessed something shady. She knew it wasn't enough yet. She had to get closer. As the days passed, Sarah began building relationships with some of the officers. She chatted with them during breaks, asking questions about their work and listening to their stories. Some of them seemed genuinely kind, but there were others, men and women who were clearly hiding something. She focused on the ones who appeared to be in the know, trying to earn their trust. The deeper she got, the more she felt the weight of the danger. Every conversation, every gesture could be a step closer to uncovering the truth or getting caught. But Sarah was determined. She wasn't going to back down now. She had already come too far. As the days passed, Sarah's role in the police department became more routine. She continued to do her work quietly, but her mind was always alert, searching for signs of the corruption she knew existed. She began to notice small things that didn't sit right with her. Officers acting secretive, speaking in hushed tones, and sharing knowing glances. At first, she thought it might just be her imagination. But then, something happened that made her certain. This wasn't just a few bad apples. This was a pattern. One afternoon, while working at her desk, Sarah overheard a conversation that caught her attention. Two officers were talking in the hallway just outside her office. They were speaking softly, but Sarah could hear enough to understand the basics of what they were discussing. "I heard it's going down tonight," one of the officers said, his voice low. "They'll pay us as usual. We just need to make sure the evidence disappears." The other officer laughed quietly. "No problem. We've been doing this for years. It's nothing new." Sarah felt a chill run down her spine. What she had overheard sounded like a plan to cover up a crime, maybe even destroy evidence. She tried to calm herself, but her mind raced. She had to be careful. She couldn't act too quickly. If she did, she might alert them, and everything would fall apart. For the next few days, Sarah kept her distance. She focused on her work, pretending to know nothing. But inside, her mind was working nonstop. She needed to gather more information, something solid. She couldn't expose this without evidence. Then, a week later, she saw something that made her stomach turn. She had stayed late at work, filing papers in the back office when she saw one of the officers slip into the storage room. She watched as he took out a stack of cash from a hidden drawer, handed it over to another officer who had just entered, and exchanged a few quiet words. Sarah's heart pounded in her chest. This was it. She had seen a bribe in action. The officer receiving the cash quickly stuffed it into his jacket pocket and walked out without a second glance. Sarah had seen enough. It was clear now. Corruption ran deep in this department. This wasn't just a few officers making mistakes. This was a network, a system of corruption that had been operating for far too long. Sarah's mind was spinning with the weight of what she had witnessed. She had always known that the corruption existed, but seeing it firsthand was something else entirely. The officers she had worked alongside, laughed with, and built small relationships with were part of something much darker than she had ever imagined. She had no choice now but to take action. She knew it wouldn't be easy, But she had to act before things got worse. Sarah took a deep breath, her hands shaking, as she made her way back to her desk. She couldn't afford to panic. She had to remain calm and gather more evidence, enough to expose them. But there was still so much to figure out. Who was behind this? How far did it go? And most importantly, could she stay undercover long enough to get the answers she needed without being caught? The tension was mounting. Sarah had just scratched the surface, and now the real challenge was about to begin. Sarah knew she had to be careful. She couldn't expose the corruption without solid evidence, and to get that, she needed to build trust with the officers. They had to believe she was one of them. If they suspected she wasn't genuine, everything she had worked for would fall apart. For the next few weeks, Sarah focused on making connections. She spent more time in the break room, chatting with the officers. She asked about their families, their hobbies, anything to seem like a normal, friendly colleague. At first, they were cautious, but over time, they began to open up. They were busy with their work, but there were moments during breaks or slow hours when the walls came down, and Sarah could sense their true personalities. She started with the officers she felt might be easier to talk to. There was Officer Daniels, a kind but quiet man who had been at the department for years. He seemed like someone who could be trusted. He had a reputation for being fair, and Sarah thought he might not be involved in the corruption. Then there was Officer Harris, younger, with an easygoing smile. He wasn't as experienced as Daniels, but he had an air of confidence that made Sarah think he could be influential. She began speaking with both officers, gradually learning about their daily routines and the people they worked with. One afternoon, Sarah sat down with Officer Daniels in the break room. She asked him about his career, how he got started in law enforcement, and what he thought of the department's current state. At first, Daniels was polite but cautious, giving only short answers. But as the conversation went on, he began to open up. He spoke about how much the job had changed over the years, and how some of the younger officers didn't seem to understand what it meant to serve the community. Back in my day, Daniels said, it wasn't about the money. It wasn't about what you could get. It was about helping people. I just wish the newer officers remembered that. Sarah listened carefully, absorbing every word. She didn't want to sound too eager, so she kept her thoughts to herself, only nodding in agreement. But inside, she was thinking about how different Daniels seemed from the others. He didn't speak like the officers involved in the bribery she had witnessed. Maybe he wasn't part of the corruption after all. Over the next few days, Sarah continued her conversations with Officer Daniels, gradually gaining his trust. He started to tell her more about his experiences, even sharing some of the challenges the department was facing. He mentioned that some officers, though not all, were getting more aggressive with their behavior. The stories he shared confirmed Sarah's suspicions, but he still seemed unaware of the full extent of the corruption. Meanwhile, Sarah also spent time with Officer Harris, who was a bit more open about his life outside of work. He invited her to join him for a few casual conversations after work. He told her about his love for sports and even mentioned that he had a cousin who worked as a private contractor. Harris was charming and easy to talk to, but Sarah wasn't sure whether he was involved in anything more serious. She had to be cautious around him, but she couldn't afford to ignore him completely. Each day, Sarah felt the pressure building. She was getting closer to the officers, but she still didn't have enough evidence to expose the corruption. As much as she wanted to confront them, she knew she had to be patient. She had to let the trust grow naturally. The last thing she wanted was to make any moves that would raise suspicion. Time was running out. Sarah could feel it. She was getting closer to the truth, but with every conversation, she felt the weight of her actions growing heavier. The danger was real, and it was only a matter of time before things escalated. Weeks had passed since Sarah began her undercover mission, and she felt as if she were walking a thin line. The more she observed, the deeper she got into the world of police corruption, but with each day, the weight of the situation became harder to bear. Every conversation, every exchange with the officers, carried more risk. She was getting closer to the truth, but she couldn't shake the feeling that the deeper she went, the more dangerous it became. One evening, after a long day at the department, Sarah sat alone in her small apartment, staring at the stack of notes she had taken. She had gathered quite a bit of information, small pieces, a few conversations, and some observations that seemed like they could connect to something bigger. But it still wasn't enough. She needed more. She needed something concrete, something that would expose the whole operation and bring the corruption to light. Her phone buzzed, breaking her thoughts. It was a message from her editor, asking for an update on her progress. Sarah's heart sank. She had nothing solid to report. Her editor had been patient, but she knew that patience had its limits. How long could she keep up the act before they started asking too many questions? A voice in her head whispered, "What if this isn't worth it? What if you're just putting yourself in danger for nothing?" The thought gnawed at her. The further she got into her mission, the more she realized how much was at stake, not just for her, but for everyone involved. If she exposed the corruption, it would change lives. Some of those officers she had been getting close to might end up facing serious consequences, and there was the personal cost. She had been living a lie, pretending to be someone she wasn't. Every time she spoke to an officer, she had to remind herself to stay in character, to keep her emotions in check. She thought about her family, her mother, her friends, and how they would react if they knew what she was doing. What if they found out she was risking her life? The thought of something happening to her made her stomach twist. She had already come this far, but there were times when she wasn't sure she could keep going. The pressure was mounting, and Sarah felt more and more isolated. The officers she had befriended, especially Officer Daniels, had begun to see her as a real part of the team. They had shared their thoughts with her, opened up about their struggles, and even joked around with her. But what if they found out who she really was? Would they feel betrayed? Would they turn on her? Her head spun with doubt. What if it's too late? What if I'm already too deep? She wondered. What if exposing this corruption isn't worth the risk to everyone I care about? But then she remembered the moment she first decided to go undercover, the reason she started this journey in the first place. The corruption was destroying the trust between the police and the people they were supposed to protect. If she could expose it, maybe things could change. Maybe the truth could make a difference. Taking a deep breath, Sarah pushed the doubts aside. She couldn't turn back now. She had come too far, and she was closer than ever to uncovering the full story. The danger was real, yes, but so was the possibility of justice. She picked up her phone and typed a quick message back to her editor. "I'm still on it. It's just taking longer than I expected. I'll have something soon." Her hand shook slightly as she hit send, but she knew that, for better or worse, there was no turning back now. Sarah's doubts had slowly faded, replaced by a renewed determination. She had come too far to stop now. After spending weeks gathering fragments of information, she knew it was time to act. But the real challenge was just beginning. She needed solid, undeniable proof of the corruption. Without that, all her efforts would be for nothing. She couldn't just rely on overheard conversations or suspicious glances. She had to capture something real, something that could not be ignored. The opportunity came unexpectedly. One afternoon, as Sarah was filing papers in the back office, she overheard a heated conversation between two officers in the hallway. At first, she tried to ignore it, focusing on her work. But then she heard something that made her freeze. "They're expecting a big payout tonight. We need to make sure the deliveries go smoothly," one officer said, his voice low and urgent. The other officer responded, "I'll take care of it. No one will find out. We've been doing this for years, haven't we?" Sarah's heart raced. This was it, the break she had been waiting for. They were talking about a major illegal exchange, something that could be tied directly to the corruption she had been tracking. But she needed more than just words. She needed proof. She quickly excused herself from the office and headed toward the break room, trying to look casual. She needed to gather her thoughts and decide her next move. Should she follow them? Should she report it immediately? After a few minutes of walking around, she realized she couldn't waste any more time. She had to act. Sarah made her way to the supply closet, where she had noticed a few officers going in and out earlier. She knew it was a common spot for some officers to stash items they didn't want anyone to find. It was risky, but it could be her only chance. As she opened the door quietly, she found the officer she had overheard earlier standing by a shelf, talking with another colleague. They were distracted, going through some documents. Sarah slipped into the room unnoticed and grabbed the file that was sitting on the top shelf. It looked out of place. Thick, heavy, and tucked behind other papers, almost as if someone didn't want it found. Her fingers shook as she held the file. It wasn't just a random collection of paperwork. It was a detailed list of transactions, names, and places. Sarah knew instantly that this was the evidence she had been searching for. There were names of people who had paid officers for favors, business owners who had avoided penalties in exchange for money. It was all there, written down in black and white. Just as she was about to slip the file back into its hiding place, the door to the supply closet swung open. Sarah's heart skipped a beat. She quickly shoved the file under her arm, trying to act casual, but the officer who had entered noticed her immediately. "What are you doing in here?" he asked, his tone suspicious. Sarah's mind raced. She couldn't get caught now. She took a deep breath and smiled. "Just looking for some extra paper. The printer's acting up again." The officer didn't seem convinced, but he didn't push further. He glanced at her for a moment, then turned and left the room. Sarah exhaled in relief. She had made it out without being caught. Now she had the evidence she needed. The file was a goldmine, details that could expose the entire operation. But she knew she couldn't stop here. She had to get it to her editor, to the people who could help her bring the story to light. But she also knew that the danger was far from over. This evidence would be her weapon, but it was also the key to unraveling everything. The officers would be watching her more closely now. Still, Sarah felt a surge of hope. She had done it. She had gathered what she needed. The truth was out there, and it was only a matter of time before the whole system would be exposed. Sarah walked back to her desk, the heavy file tucked under her jacket. Her heart was racing. She couldn't believe she had just secured the evidence that could bring the entire corrupt operation to light. But even as she felt a rush of relief, she knew the danger was far from over. The officers she had befriended, especially Officer Daniels, had become a little too familiar with her. The closer she got to the truth, the more vulnerable she became. She tried to shake off the fear that gnawed at her. She had come this far, and she couldn't back out now. Her phone buzzed in her pocket. It was a message from her editor. "How's it going? Got anything solid yet?" Sarah paused. She had been hesitant to share anything until she had more evidence. But this was it. She couldn't keep pretending she was still just gathering information. She typed quickly, "I have the evidence. It's all here." She stared at the screen for a moment before hitting send. There was no turning back now. She had placed herself in too deep. But just as she was about to breathe a sigh of relief, she saw something that made her freeze in place. Officer Harris, the young officer she had been speaking with casually, was walking toward her. He wasn't alone. With him was Officer Daniels. Both were looking at her, but there was something in their eyes that made Sarah's heart drop. They weren't smiling like they usually did. Instead, their expressions were serious, almost too serious. "Sarah," Officer Daniels said, his voice soft but firm, "can we talk for a moment?" Sarah's stomach twisted. Something didn't feel right. "Of course," she said, trying to remain calm. She stood up and followed them down the hallway to a small office at the back of the department. Once they were inside, Officer Daniels closed the door behind them. "This isn't easy to say," Officer Harris began, his tone lower than usual. "But we need to ask you something." Sarah felt her pulse quicken. Her mind raced. She had been careful, hadn't she? She hadn't made any mistakes. She had kept her story straight. But now, it seemed that everything was crumbling around her. Daniels looked at her for a moment before speaking. "We know what you've been doing, Sarah. We've known for a while." Sarah's heart skipped a beat. She felt as though the ground had been ripped out from under her. She had never suspected either of them. She thought they were trustworthy. "What are you talking about?" she asked, her voice trembling. "We've been watching you," Daniel said quietly. "We figured it out a few weeks ago. You're not who you say you are." Sarah's breath caught in her throat. How had they known? She had been so careful. But now, as she looked into their eyes, she could see the truth. The kindness she had seen in them had all been an act. They had been pretending, just like she had. "You should have known," Harris said, shaking his head. "You think you're the only one trying to expose the corruption. You're not the only one in this game." The words hit Sarah like a punch to the gut. She had been betrayed by the very officers she had trusted. Sarah's mind was spinning. How could this happen? Who else knew? What did they want from her? She couldn't let them stop her. She had come too far. But now, she had to be even more careful. They had played their part well, gaining her trust to the point where she had let her guard down. But she had one thing on her side now. She had the evidence. "I'm not afraid of you," Sarah said, her voice stronger than she felt. "I will still expose everything you've done." Officer Daniels gave a small, bitter smile. "We'll see about that." Sarah knew the stakes were higher than ever. She had to act fast. She had been betrayed, but that wasn't the end. It was just the beginning of a much more dangerous game. Sarah's heart raced as she stood in the small office, facing the two officers who had once seemed like allies. The walls around her felt like they were closing in, but she knew she couldn't let fear control her now. They knew who she was. They knew she had been gathering evidence to expose the corruption within the department, but she couldn't back down. She had come too far to stop now. Officer Daniels gave her a cold smile. "You really thought you could just walk in here and uncover everything without anyone noticing?" Sarah swallowed hard but stood tall. "I didn't want to believe it," she said quietly. "I thought you were different, but I see the truth now. You're just as corrupt as the rest." Harris took a step forward. His eyes were cold, and Sarah could see the way he was watching her, waiting for a sign of weakness. She had no idea how long they had been aware of her true intentions. Had they known all along, or had they only recently figured it out? "You think you're the first person to try this?" Harris asked, his voice dripping with sarcasm. "People like you come and go. It's nothing personal, just business." Sarah's mind was racing. She couldn't let them intimidate her. They were trying to scare her into backing down, but she wouldn't let them. She had to stay focused. She had the evidence, and she knew it was only a matter of time before everything came to light. They might have turned on her, but she wasn't going to give up. "You're wrong," Sarah said, her voice steady. "I'm not going anywhere. I have what I need. The truth is out there, and it's only a matter of time before it gets out." Officer Daniels stepped closer, his expression hardening. "You think you can just waltz out of here with that file and make everything right? You have no idea how deep this goes. If you think you're going to bring us down, you're in for a rude awakening." Sarah's breath caught in her throat. She had always known the danger was real, but now she could feel it in every word, every movement. They weren't just going to let her walk away. She was trapped. For a moment, everything felt still. She had the evidence, but without the support she needed, without backup, how could she make sure it got to the right hands? The weight of the situation pressed on her chest, and she had to make a choice: run or fight. Just then, Sarah's phone buzzed in her pocket. It was a message from her editor. "I've got a contact in the department. They say they know what's going on. Send me the file." Her heart skipped a beat. She had a chance. A small one, but it was enough. Her editor was on her side. She wasn't alone in this fight. "I'm not afraid of you," Sarah said again, her voice firmer now. "And I'm not backing down." Harris sneered, stepping toward the door. "We'll see how long you last." Before Sarah could react, the officers turned and left the room. The tension hung in the air, thick and heavy. Sarah stood there for a moment, catching her breath. The adrenaline was still coursing through her veins, but she couldn't let it overwhelm her. She had one chance left. She quickly texted her editor back, sending the file she had worked so hard to get. "The evidence is in your hands now. Don't let them cover it up." As she hit send, Sarah knew that this wasn't over. It was just the beginning. The officers might have tried to scare her, but she wasn't going to be intimidated. The truth was out there, and now it was in the right hands. She just had to wait and see how it would all unfold. But one thing was certain: she wouldn't stop until the corruption was exposed, no matter what it took. The hours after sending the evidence were the longest Sarah had ever experienced. Her mind raced with countless thoughts. Had she done the right thing? Was her editor going to take action? Would the truth finally come to light? The fear of the unknown weighed heavily on her shoulders. She knew the officers would be watching her closely now, and the department would do whatever it could to cover up what she had uncovered. But Sarah was no longer afraid. She had already risked too much to turn back. The next morning, Sarah arrived at the department, her heart pounding. She walked through the doors with the same routine, trying to appear normal. The officers who had betrayed her didn't look at her the same way anymore. Their eyes were filled with suspicion, but Sarah kept her head down and focused on her work. The plan was simple: stay calm and gather whatever final pieces she could before everything exploded. Then, around midday, her phone buzzed again. It was her editor. "The file's with the right people. They're taking action. You did it." Sarah's breath caught in her throat. The weight of the words hit her all at once. The corruption, the years of secrecy, were about to be exposed. She quickly typed back, "Thank you. It's not over yet. They'll know soon enough." As the day went on, the tension in the department grew palpable. Officers seemed more on edge, whispering in corners. Their movements rushed. Sarah could feel the storm approaching, and she knew it wouldn't be long before everything changed. At 3 p.m., the call came. The head of the department called an emergency meeting. Sarah's heart sank. She wasn't invited to the meeting, but she knew what was happening. The evidence had reached the right hands, and now the department was scrambling to control the damage. A few hours later, the news broke. A large story was published about widespread corruption within the police department, detailing the bribery, cover-ups, and illegal dealings that had been going on for years. The names of the officers involved were all there, including those who had betrayed her. The truth was out for everyone to see. The aftermath was swift. Investigations were launched, and several officers were arrested. The public outrage was intense, with people demanding accountability from those in power. The department was thrown into chaos, as leaders who had tried to hide the corruption were now facing their own downfall. Sarah watched the events unfold from her desk, her heart beating a little faster as she realized just how much had changed. She had done it. Against all odds, she had exposed the truth. The officers who had once made her feel welcome now faced the consequences of their actions. But as Sarah watched the chaos unfold, she couldn't help but feel conflicted. She had succeeded, but at what cost? She thought about the officers she had trusted, Officer Daniels, who had opened up to her about his frustrations with the department, and Officer Harris, whose charm had made her question everything. Could they have been part of the corruption all along, or had they just been swept up in it? As Sarah looked at the headlines, she knew the battle wasn't over. The damage had been done, but the work of rebuilding the trust between the police and the community would take years. She had uncovered the truth, but the real challenge would be making sure the change lasted. For now, though, Sarah felt a sense of peace. The story was out, the corruption exposed. And in that moment, she knew she had done the right thing. The fight for justice wasn't easy, but it was worth it.